In one of last week's lectures, we talked about the growing division in the United States as the nation became torn asunder by this issue of slavery. And we talked about how in this new atmosphere, politics became divided based less on party and more on sectional interests. And essentially this would create a new party system where you're going to have the Republicans dominating the northern regions as a party that is opposed to the extension of slavery and the expansion of slavery into the new territories. And on the other end, you are going to have the Democrats, who are primarily a Southern party and were in favor of slavery and states' rights. Well, as this political debate played out, we also seen a growing reliance on violence, whether it be in Congress, in the caning that we mentioned previously, or the events in the Kansas territory, as that state was deciding about its future in terms of slavery, the idea of popular sovereignty. Well, we're going to continue this trend, and we are going to continue to see this growing radicalism in both the North and the South by 1859 that will eventually culminate, of course, in the following year in 1860, secession of the Southern states, and eventually the Civil War. So that is what this lecture will be talking about, this road to disunion and eventually the Civil War itself. We're going to begin our story by returning to a figure that we talked about in the last lecture, and that was John Brown. If you remember in the previous lecture, we talked about John Brown's involvement in the violent outbreak that took place and that occurred in Kansas over that state's future in terms of whether slavery would exist or not exist in that territory. But now we're going to pick up his story and what happens after that. Because after partaking in the violence of Kansas, John Brown moved to the east in preparation for a larger action against slavery that he hoped would lead to a much wider opposition to this terrible, terrible institution. So during his journey eastward, John Brown convinced several wealthy anti-slavery supporters, the so-called Secret Six, to give him money to lead an insurrection of runaway slaves against their masters and ultimately encourage a massive revolt by slaves across the nation. Now this is something that John had been dreaming of even before he took part in the Kansas actions, going all the way back to the 1840s. And as he told Frederick Douglass, who we've talked about previously, who was a prominent former slave and then he eventually became an abolitionist, as John Brown toward Frederick Douglass before the raid, trying to encourage him to also take part in this, the following, quote, "When I strike, the bees will swarm." And the bees in this reference were, of course, to the slaves. And that idea, again, the hope was that this raid would incite a slave rebellion or insurrection. Well, ultimately, Frederick Douglass refused to participate in the planned raid, predicting that it would fail. And he would be quite prescient when he came to this prediction, because that is in fact what happened. Not to give you too much of a spoiler here, but that is in fact what occurred. But nonetheless, to tell about this story here of this raid, it began on October 16th, 1859, when John Brown led 18 men, including 12 fugitive slaves, in a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Within 2 days, he and his men were surrounded by future Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart. To see the irony of this situation, that you would actually see a kind of a precursor to the Civil War actually playing out here in Harper's Ferry. But nonetheless, we would see these two future Confederate generals approach Brown and urge him to surrender. So as this was going on, it turned out that the slave insurrection that Brown had hoped for never materialized. The bees never swarmed, if you will, to go back to that earlier quote in that conversation between John Brown and Frederick Douglass. But nonetheless, when John Brown was offered this chance to surrender, he outright refused, responding in the following way, quote, "No, I prefer to die here." Well, eventually, Brown and his men were overtaken via force, and he was captured. But he was only captured after he and his raiders killed 4 and wounded 9 others of those trying to put down his rebellion. This did not come without cost. 10 of his own men, were also killed. He and the 6 of the remaining men who actually survived were arrested, and they were put on trial in Virginia. What were they put on trial for? These things, 3 things. First of all, murder, inciting a slave insurrection, and treason. John Brown was convicted of all accounts and executed on December 2nd. But here's the thing. Even as John Brown walked to the gallows to be hanged, he passed his last written statement to the jailer. And this is the image that we see on the bottom right-hand corner, his last prophecy, if you will. It read the following, as you can see. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. Truer words had never been spoken, because of course what we are going to see is within a year a civil war will break out, and it will in fact be the bloodiest war in this nation's brief history here by the mid-19th century. But more important than the actual event itself, John Brown's raid again in itself was not a success. It had no ramifications immediately in terms of actually bringing about a slave insurrection. But more importantly, John Brown's raid was proof for many Southerners that the Northern abolitionists intended to eventually end slavery in all of America. And we've already seen glimpses of this before, and we'll see glimpses of it even more so in the next lecture. This idea among Southerners, particularly Democrats, that the abolitionists are working hand in hand with the Republicans, with Abraham Lincoln, and they are seeking to end slavery. So eventually what is going to happen is we are going to see some southern states, including Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, will even pass laws in their state legislatures proclaiming that it would secede, meaning break apart, break away from the Union, if Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election. This, even though the Republicans, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the next lecture, even though Republicans, including Abraham Lincoln, spoke out strongly against Brown's actions. Nonetheless, these fire eaters, as they came to be known, repeatedly claimed that the North was plotting to end slavery. So we see here the growing conspiracy theories. This one taking root in the South, the response of these Southern fire eaters viewing the Republican Party as no different than abolitionists hell-bent on ending slavery everywhere, when that could be no further from the truth. But we also see conspiracy theories brewing in the North as well. And proof of this is, for instance, in one of the newspapers that I have quoted on the screen here. Because what we are going to see is, as these conspiracy theories were rising in the South, Republicans also pointed to various events in recent history to highlight what in their mind was a different kind of conspiracy. So for instance, Republicans also often pointed to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act that we talked about previously, and the 1850 Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what they did was they pointed to this as proof as what was known as the slave power conspiracy. The slave power conspiracy. And this was the belief, essentially, that the federal government was in cahoots, if you will. They were working in alliance with Southerners to ensure that slavery was forever perpetrated and carried out in this country, that it existed forever in this country. Well, as a result of John Brown's raid, abolitionists and those believers in this, again, slave power conspiracy, they would become more emboldened, as evidenced by this Massachusetts newspaper's response to Brown's death. As you can see, the Newberry Herald stated the following, quote, "We shall be 1,000 times more anti-slavery than we ever dared to think of being before. Why was this necessary? It was necessary because of that slave power conspiracy. More strident actions had to be undertaken to ensure that slavery was destroyed." We can see some of this theory and ideology in the Southern mind in this Southern response to Brown's raid that comes from Charleston, South Carolina newspaper, the Mercury. I want to read it because it's worthwhile to see what the South was thinking during this time in 1859 after the raid. While we can see no cause for present alarm, none can blind their eyes to the audacity of the attempt or fail to regard it as a pregnant sign of the times, a prelude to what must and will recur again and again as the progress of sectional hate and black Republican success advances to their consummation. And what will be the effect? Are occurrences like these calculated to strengthen the institution of slavery in the border states by adding to its advantages and value in the appreciation of the public there? Is not the condition of things to which we submit inevitably tending to render slave property in the neighborhood of Mason and Dixon's line a dangerous and troublesome nuisance? I want to stop here for a second and talk about what this first paragraph is saying. So what we can see here, a prelude. John Brown's raid was a prelude to what must and will recur again and again. The fear again of slave revolts, now being encouraged and led by white Northerners. And why? All in an effort to promote this idea of what the South considered sectional hate and black Republican success. These are African Americans, the South is claiming, who are taking control of the Republican Party and putting it on the path towards civil war and the disunion of this country. And as we can see here, this is a fear of slavery being forced to its ultimate end. Second paragraph. Slaves can neither be kept nor managed. By our tame and passive policy, the cotton states, which are vitally interested in the institution, are actually allowing slavery to be carried out of the border states. The continuance of this policy will slowly but surely build up an abolition party in states that now are strongly pro-slavery and ready to back us in resistance to the ever-recurring aggressions of the North and of her people. The march of events is onwards. Let the signs of the times be read and interpreted aright. Here again is the idea. Yes, this is happening in Virginia, one of the border states, but the Charleston, South Carolina Mercury newspaper is saying this is just a foreshadow of what is going to come. If we allow this to happen in Virginia, it will eventually reach deep down into the deep South, and those states that are now, quote, strongly pro-slavery will eventually give up the fight and allow the North to take over the South and thus end slavery. Here is this conspiratorial thinking that will be prevalent in the South, but also in the North. As a result of this sort of thinking, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida would pass laws in their state legislatures proclaiming that they would secede, break away, if Lincoln won the presidential election. This, even though Republicans, including Abraham Lincoln, spoke out strongly against Brown's actions. Nonetheless, these fire eaters, as these Southerners came to be known, repeatedly claimed that the North was plotting to end slavery. Meanwhile, Republicans pointed to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Dred Scott decision as proof of the slave power conspiracy. In short, conspiracy theories are running amok, and therefore the chance for compromise is thinner and thinner, and it's getting worse and worse every day, and this will inevitably lead to a breaking apart of this union. Let's now talk about this path to secession. We're going to begin with Senator John Crittenden, who represented the border state of Kentucky. John Crittenden attempted to bring the nation back from the edge by proposing in late 1860 several constitutional amendments to the Constitution. These included expanding the Missouri Compromise all the way to the Pacific Ocean, allowing for the continuation of the interstate slave trade, and finally, requiring federal compensation for slave owners who were unable to retrieve runaway slaves. Rejected by Lincoln, the compromise was narrowly defeated in the Senate by a vote of 25 to 23. Thus, this last chance gasp at compromise by John Crittenden had failed, and as a result, the Union would in fact break apart. This occurred on December 20th, 1860, when delegates in South Carolina met to consider seceding from the Union. They voted unanimously to secede. Not a single member
of this delegation from South Carolina voted against secession. The following month, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, and Louisiana all seceded as well. On February 4th, 1861, delegates from the 7 states, as well as those from states considering seceding, met in Montgomery, Alabama, where they formed the Confederate States of America. Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis was selected as the Confederacy's president. So here we have a new Southern president for the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, the Mississippi Senator. Eventually, after this new nation was created, the Confederate States of America was created, Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina eventually joined it. So as you can see here, we are now having a complete breakdown of America, a complete division of America. But what I want to mention here is something that we're going to see throughout this lecture, and that is an effort by the North to limit its aims here, if you will. Because if you notice, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland, among others, would be slave states that would not join the Confederacy. Rather, they would join the Union in the North. Therefore, I want you to keep an eye on this, or keep this in the back of your mind, because Northern leaders, including Abraham Lincoln, will toe a very close line to try to appeal to these moderates, these border states, to ensure that they stay in the Union and not anger them by demanding immediate emancipation for slaves, and then force these border states to join the Confederacy and therefore weaken the Union in its war against the South. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we're talking about some of these things in this lecture and the next. Before we talk about the war, I want to take a brief pit stop, if you will, and look at the new Constitution of the Confederate States of America and compare it to our U.S. Constitution. Primarily here, as you can see on the screen, the preambles. So here's the biggest thing. In looking at the Confederate States of America, it says the following: "We, the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character, in order to form a permanent federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the Confederate States of America." Now, I'm not going to read the U.S. Constitution preamble, but we're still going to compare the two. Most notably, right from the get-go, the Confederate Constitution is putting the power in the hands of the state when it says each state acting in its own sovereign and independent character. In the U.S. Constitution, there is only one sovereign power, and that sovereign power is the U.S. government. Not the case here in this Confederate State Constitution. Obviously, states' rights tied distinctly to this idea of slavery. We also see, in addition to that, this talking about God. We do not see God mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, but it is mentioned in this Confederate States of America Constitution, basically stipulating that God is on their side. God is in favor of these Confederate states against the U.S. northern side, the Union.
With the southern states seceding from the Union, the question became, what now? Would the United States, the Union, the northern states, would they make an effort to bring the southern states back into the Union? And if so, how would that be achieved? Well, if we look early on, we need to start the story by talking about the president at this time, who is a lame duck president in every sense of the word. Now, when people talk in politics about a lame duck presidency or a lame duck Congress, these are the congressmen or the presidents who are in power after the election was held. So by this point in December of 1860, the presidential election had already been held. Abraham Lincoln had won. He would come into the White House. The inauguration was actually in March back then. So therefore, James Buchanan was a lame duck president. But in fact, he wasn't only a lame duck president in name, if you will, but his actions in response to Southern secession also point to him as a lame duck president that really didn't do much. Because when South Carolina and other southern states seceded from the Union, Buchanan presided over the fractured nation as its president. But basically, he did nothing. In fact, in his last State of the Union address of December 3, 1860, which is what we can see on the screen here, Buchanan admitted that secession was not legal, but he also believed that the United States could not stop it. As he explained to Congress, quote, "All for which the slave states have ever contended is to be let alone and permitted to manage their domestic institutions in their own way. As sovereign states, they, and they alone, are responsible before God and the world for the slavery existing among them. For this, the people of the North are not more responsible and have no more fight to interfere than with similar institutions in Russia or in Brazil," Buchanan said. This is an extraordinary statement here. Basically, what Buchanan is accepting is the notion that the South is no longer part of the Union, that they are now the Confederate States of America, therefore no different than any other state any other country like Russia or Brazil. Well, as it turned out, the U.S. military felt otherwise, and we will see this most clearly in Charleston, South Carolina, the heart of the secessionist movement, particularly at the military fort Sumter. When South Carolina secessionists surrounded Fort Sumter, which was located on a tiny island off the coast near Charleston, South Carolina, Union Major Robert Anderson refused to surrender. Despite his lack of action regarding Southern secession during this time, Buchanan did actually react, and he reacted by sending an unarmed steamship of supplies to Fort Sumter. As it approached on January 9th of 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire, forcing the ship to flee, therefore never bringing the supplies to the struggling American troops at Fort Sumter. Though an act of war, Buchanan actually refused to respond. He was not willing to go to war to preserve the Union, or to restore the Union, I should say. So therefore, what we are going to see is he is of the mindset, was Buchanan. He was of the mindset, very unrealistically, that there was still the possibility to achieve some sort of compromise with the South. Well, by the time Abraham Lincoln entered the White House in March of 1861, Major Anderson, whose troops were still stuck in Fort Sumter, had written to report that his men were running out of food and under constant bombardment by Confederate troops and their cannons. Thus, the new president decided to act. Abraham Lincoln sent unarmed ships with supplies for the 69 soldiers who were still at Fort Sumter. Not surprisingly, the Confederates replied in the same manner as they had done when Buchanan attempted a similar maneuver. To prevent the ship from reaching the fort, Confederates attacked the fort this time, rather than a ship, and this attack took place on Fort Sumter on April 12th. This onslaught of Fort Sumter would continue for 34 hours straight until Union Major Robert Anderson lowered the American flag and surrendered to Confederate troops. Unbeknownst to many, including Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War had officially begun with this takeover of Fort Sumter. And we can see an image of this on the right. All the cannonballs, the fuselage being shot at Fort Sumter off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, here's the thing. As we're talking about this outbreak of the war, I want to refer back to some of the states that we mentioned in looking at secession. Following the outbreak of war, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, these so-called border states that I referred to earlier, all of which allowed slavery, decided that they were going to join the Union. Virginia, for its part, which had joined the Confederacy after all, Robert Lee came from Virginia, would actually break apart and split into two states, with West Virginia breaking apart and joining the Union. Well, as war became inevitable, on May 3, 1861, without the approval of Congress, Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 Army volunteers, which would eventually be approved by Congress after the fact. Now, as this war is starting to expand and actually pick up steam and turn into a real war, from a purely statistical perspective, the North actually held many advantages, as we'll see on the next slide.
These advantages, in fact, were one of the reasons why so many Northerners wanted to take the fight to the South. So let's take a look at this nice, easy to understand chart. First of all, in terms of just the number of states involved on each side, the Union held an advantage, 23 states versus the 11 states associated with the Confederacy. Money. A lot of the financial institutions in this country, as we just talked about in the past, are in the Northeast, so it makes sense that the Union would have $263 million at its disposal compared to just $74 million for the Confederacy. Population as well. The North would have fewer slaves, just 500,000, compared to 3.5 million slaves in the Confederacy. But look at the number of free persons in the North. 21 million versus just 5.5 million in the South. Factories. Again, America's industry, as we've talked about in the past, is primarily in the North. Therefore, 110,000 factories in the North versus just 21,000 in the Confederacy. And therefore, it would make sense that the North would have more workers, 1.2 million, versus just 111,000 in the South. Troop strength, very much in favor of the Union as well, 2.6 million troops versus just less than half of that for the Confederacy, 750,000 to 1.2 million, depending on what source you look at. But despite these advantages, the Union would actually lose its first major battle at Bull Run in July 1861.
Despite these various advantages that we just talked about on the previous slide, when the war actually started, we would see the Union struggling to compete against the Confederate troops. And we see this immediately in the first battle of Bull Run, also known as Manassas. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about overall strategy at the start of this war. On May 3, 1861, again, the day that Abraham Lincoln would call for 75,000 Army volunteers, the Union general, who was leading the Union Army, Winfield Scott, proposed what critics called the Anaconda Plan. This strategy involved the naval blockade of the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, and the Ohio River. The belief being that if these waterways were blocked, this would cause great economic harm to the Confederacy and slowly choke Southern resistance. This is very much like an anaconda would do to its prey, and that's where it gets the name, the Anaconda Plan. But in other words, this strategy meant that the North would not invade the South and that the war would last years, as opposed to a single decisive battle. And in fact, what you are going to see is a lot of critics of Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan would be up in arms over his proposal because a lot of people, including Abraham Lincoln, believe that this would be a quick war. It would end after a single decisive battle. And therefore, what you would see is a lot of critics would question Winfield Scott's loyalty to the Union, believing that he just wasn't patriotic enough, that he didn't believe Northern troops, the Union troops, could actually defeat the Confederate troops. And in fact, what we are going to see is at the start of the war, most Americans demanded a direct attack on Confederate forces. For instance, on June 26, 1861, the influential New York Tribune editorialized, quote, "Forward to Richmond." That is in fact what this was all about. The voices who were in favor of this quick, massive strike, single decisive battle, were pushing Abraham Lincoln and Union generals to invade Richmond, take over the capital of the Confederacy, and end the war quickly. To this end, we would see Abraham Lincoln ordered a guy by the name of General Irvin McDowell to launch an attack against Confederate troops at Manassas Junction in Virginia near Bull Run Creek. Richmond, to go back to my point that I just made a few seconds ago, Richmond stood just 107 miles to the south. That is why, again, Abraham Lincoln instructed Irvin McDowell to attack Bull Run because it would be en route to Richmond and eventually end this war in a matter of time. So, leave no doubt about it, this first battle of Bull Run was the first major battle of the Civil War. It occurred on July 21st, 1861. General McDowell led 35,000 volunteer troops, again almost half the army that Lincoln called up in May of 1861 would be used in this battle here at Bull Run, and they would take on the fight against the Confederates. It was expected to be a quick and easy victory for the United States, so much so that nearby Washington, D.C. residents, including members of Congress, actually came to the battlefield at Bull Run here in Manassas, Virginia. They came to the battlefield with their picnic gear. They were actually going to picnic and watch the fighting, believing that it was no different than a play, and they were going to enjoy it just as they would any other form of entertainment. However, what we are going to see is the inexperienced soldiers and commanders of the Union Army simply could not deal with the Confederates. Therefore, the Union troops would actually have to retreat in what was known as the, quote, Great Skedaddle. And this was quite embarrassing for the Union. This was quite embarrassing for the Union, and it shocked a lot of Northerners. But here's the important thing. Even though it was a victory for the Confederacy, though the Confederates won, they were so disorganized that they did not pursue the fleeing Union soldiers. So it was a defeat for the Union, but it could have been far worse. But nonetheless, as I referred to just a minute ago, the Union loss shocked Northerners, who again were all about forward to Richmond, forward to Richmond. This is going to be a quick and decisive battle, and the war is going to be over, and the North is going to be victorious. Well, as evidence of this shock, a senator from Ohio, a Republican senator by the name of Benjamin Wade, wrote that, quote, all is gloomy and despairing here. Clearly, Northerners, Americans, they were feeling terrible that this idea of forward to Richmond was not going to happen. Perhaps this war was going to be more drawn out as Winfield Scott had predicted. And in fact, what we are going to see is more and more people after the first battle of Bull Run are going to begin to say that the Anaconda Plan put forward by Scott looked in fact like the best strategy for Union troops to follow. What we are going to see on the other side of the ball, the Confederates for their part followed a defensive strategy, hoping that prolonging the war might convince Northerners to seek a negotiated settlement. Nonetheless, after the first battle of Bull Run, we now see here again the Anaconda Plan, which will become the strategy of the United States for the foreseeable future. And I just wanted to pause briefly here to show you this map, this image, the visualization of the Anaconda Plan. As you can see, the blockade of the Mississippi River, we see the blockade of the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic, again, to basically make the South scream out and basically strangle their economy, so eventually they will give up. But again, initially this was not a popular idea because a lot of Americans thought this war would be quick. Battle of Bull Run proved otherwise, and that's why Scott's Great Snake and his Anaconda Plan would become the policy that would be followed. On September 17, 1862, Americans witnessed the bloodiest single-day battle of the entire Civil War. By this point in the fall of 1862, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had decided to shift from a defensive to an offensive war. Now this meant that the Confederate troops would attempt to cross the Potomac River into Maryland. And in doing so, Lee came face to face with Union General George McClellan at Antietam Creek here in Maryland. The Confederates, as had been the case so often in this war, in the first year or so of the war, were outnumbered 87,000 to 50,000. But Union General McClellan allowed Lee to escape. In fact, Lee actually refused to withdraw his troops back across the Potomac into Virginia. Rather, when his troops were defeated in this battle, he actually stood outside of Antietam with his troops, sort of daring McClellan, the Union general, to follow, which he never did. And in fact, what we are going to see in these early years of the war is Lincoln just beside himself when his military generals refused to follow retreating Confederate troops. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was so disgusted this time around in September of 1862 after Antietam by McClellan's failure to pursue Lee that Lincoln wrote the following to him. And this was on October 25th, 1862, so some month after this battle. He said the following to his leading general, quote, "I have just read your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done that fatigues anything?" Basically, this is a jab at McClellan, who's basically was too cautious in the eyes of Lincoln. Basically, what this letter is saying, your horses and your men and you have been sitting around doing nothing. You did not pursue Lee after the Battle of Antietam, so how can your horses be tired and sore? It just didn't make sense to Abraham Lincoln. For some time, as I alluded to earlier, Lincoln had been angry at McClellan for his caution. Nonetheless, despite this caution and unwillingness to pursue Lee across the Potomac, the Union's victory prevented Lee and the Confederate troops from moving further north and continuing his offensive. So there was that. In terms of casualties, remember this was the bloodiest single-day battle in all of the Civil War. In terms of casualties, a combined 4,800 Confederate and Union soldiers died in the battle, and another 18,500 were wounded. Now these numbers are large in and of themselves, but it's even more outrageous to understand that all of these casualties occurred over just a 12-hour battle. Now to show you again the scale of death on this day here, on September 17th of 1862, by comparison, there were only 6,000 casualties, death and wounded combined, during the infamous D-Day invasion of 1944. If any of you have ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, there's that opening scene where the American troops are storming the beaches of Normandy, and there's just blood filling the screen. That was a very realistic portrayal of this D-Day invasion in 1944. It was a deadly day, but that paled in comparison to what we saw some 80 years before in 1862 during this Battle of Antietam. Indicative of this bloodshed is Bloody Lane. This is the image that we see on the right of the screen here. Bloody Lane was sort of a gully, a sort of half circle that Confederates had used for cover as they shot their rifles. But eventually this would be overrun by the approaching Union forces, and what you are going to see is just this gully, if you will, this little indent will be filled with bloody bodies, as hence the name, the Bloody Lane of Antietam. So when this battle ended, Abraham Lincoln had come to a realization. Now, one of those realizations, as we'll talk about in the next class, was that slavery had to be ended. It wasn't no longer just about preserving the Union, it was now actually about ending slavery. But beyond the issue of slavery, Lincoln also realized that preserving the Union would require a total conquest of the South. Thus, he no longer was concerned about reaching a compromise, and instead began preparing for this total war that would not only bring the Union together, but also end slavery. It would be another 6 or so months before Robert E. Lee decided once again to take a stab at invading the North. And this would begin in May of 1863, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee led his 50,000 troops against the Union's 75,000 troops. And eventually what we are going to see as Lee is making his second invasion into the North, he will eventually defeat the Union at Chancellorsville. But following this stunning victory, Lee would decide that he needed to go all the way to the end zone, if you will. He believed, did Lee, that such a strategy would allow the Confederates to do several things. First of all, gather more supplies. Secondly, inflame further anti-war protests in the North. During this time, or by this time I should say, there was a ton of protests. There were a ton of protests in the North over drafts in particular, drafting men to fight in the military. Lee believed that a successful invasion by the Confederates would instigate more protests of this sort. And finally, what we would see as well is that the Confederates would hopefully gain foreign recognition. The hope was, in addition to, again, gathering more supplies, encouraging further anti-war protests in the North, that Confederate victories in the North would convince particularly the British to recognize and help the Confederates in their war. Finally, the final goal, the final aim of this second invasion of the North was simply to take over the capital, to take over Washington, D.C. in the North. So, as this is going on, what we are going to see is by late June of 1863, Lee and his troops will arrive at Gettysburg. And I notice on the screen here, make sure if you're copying what it says on the screen, that's supposed to say July 1 through 3, 1863. But nonetheless, we are going to see the Battle of Gettysburg lasting from July 1st to July 3rd of 1863. And what this battle will prove is that General Lee, despite his best hopes and best efforts, will be unable to invade the North. This will prove the death knell, if you will, of Robert E. Lee's second invasion of the North, ultimately, again, turning it into failure. So when was the turning point of this battle? The turning point of this battle came with Confederate General George Pickett's charge, and this is the image here that we see on the right. This involved a full frontal assault by 12,500 Confederates on the Union's strongest position up on Cemetery Hill. The failure of Pickett's charge would lead to the Confederates' defeat at Gettysburg. And not only that, but Lee was actually forced to retreat back to Virginia and abandon plans to attack Washington via Pennsylvania. And just as importantly, in addition to the fact that this was a failed invasion, we also see General Lee losing more than 50% of his army to death, wounds, or capture. In total, there were 51,112 casualties at Gettysburg, more than any other battle during the Civil War. Yet again, however, as General Lee is fleeing from the battlefield with his defeated troops, we would see once again that the Union did not pursue him, which led Lincoln once again to angrily write another letter, this time to General Meade, the leader of the Union troops at Gettysburg. Lincoln wrote this letter on July 14, 1863, and he said the following about Robert E. Lee, quote, "He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely." He continued, quote, "Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it." So once again, Lincoln's military generals on the field disappoint him. He wants to take the fight to Lee. The military men are too cautious. Well, eventually what we are going to see is this changes, along with a change in leadership in 1864, and that change in leadership is the coming to authority of General Ulysses S. Grant. As the battle raged in the North, in Pennsylvania, and eventually reaching Gettysburg, we would see Union General Ulysses S. Grant move his troops further south along the Mississippi River, eventually reaching Vicksburg, Mississippi. Within 3 weeks, as this was occurring, Grant had cornered the Confederate Army in Vicksburg. And this would be basically the carrying out of Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. That's what we're seeing taking place here with Ulysses S. Grant in his movement down the Mississippi River and eventually his siege of Vicksburg here in Mississippi. Now, this siege of Vicksburg would last from late May 1863 into June. And what would happen during the siege was gunboats and cannons would constantly bombard the rebel troops in Vicksburg. We can see an image here on the left of the actual station cannons that were used against Vicksburg, shooting down cannonball after cannonball on the innocent, oftentimes innocent people of Vicksburg. because in fact many civilians were forced to actually live in their cellars or sometimes even caves that they had dug, seeking protection from this onslaught of Union forces. One Vicksburg woman wrote in her diary as she experienced this constant bombardment from these cannons, quote, "We are utterly cut off from the world, surrounded by a circle of fire. The fiery shower of Union shells go on day and night. A circle of fire." You can just imagine in your mind the imagery all around them again. No choice but to buckle down and try to protect themselves and their families from this terrible, terrible war. Well, on July 4th, 1863, the Confederates at Vicksburg surrendered. Coming on the heels of Robert E. Lee's retreat from Pennsylvania, the Confederate defeat at Vicksburg represented a major blow to the Confederacy. Its president, a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis, who we've read about previously in our primary documents as well, claimed that Vicksburg was, quote, "the nailhead that held the South's two halves together." What he meant by this was that with this victory at Vicksburg, the Union now controlled the Mississippi River and the town of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was significant, and this is where it gets to the idea of a nailhead bringing the South's two halves together. Vicksburg had separated Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy. So therefore, this really messed up the supply lines of the South by the Union, the United States, controlling Vicksburg. Well, in response to these two defeats, to again show you just the terrible mood in the South, we would see Josiah Gorges, Chief of Confederate Ordnance, proclaim the following, quote, "The Confederacy totters to its destruction. Yet despite the dire straits that the South was in, and the feelings of defeat that both Jefferson Davis and Josiah Gorges were feeling, the war itself would continue for nearly 2 more years, despite these major Union victories." Yet it became clear that this war was no longer a war that would go on much longer. Because even as the war dragged on, we see a change in 1864 that points to perhaps an end. And that change, again, that I alluded to earlier, was the coming to power as the commanding general of the Union Army of Ulysses S. Grant in 1864. Now, interestingly enough, the reason why Abraham Lincoln appointed him as commanding general of the Union Army in this year was because Lincoln looked to strengthen his odds of re-election, and he believed that Ulysses S. Grant would help him succeed on the battlefield, which would then help him win in the ballot box. So here, Ulysses S. Grant, it's important to understand that he had a different mindset regarding Union strategy during the war. He was less interested in capturing Richmond. Again, that idea of forward to Richmond, that didn't appeal to Ulysses S. Grant. Rather, Grant set out to defeat Confederate armies by waging a relentless total war of attrition, one battle after another. And what a war of attrition simply means is kill more of your enemy. Kill more of your enemy, pay attention to body counts, and sooner or later, the South would have to get back. Now, even before he came to lead the Union Army in 1864, as far back as the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, which was, again, a sort of pivotal battle in the sense that it was a major loss for the Union Army. But nonetheless, as far back as this battle, as Grant explained in his memoirs, which were published in the 1880s, quote, he, quote, "gave up all the idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest. Up to that time it had been the policy of our army, certainly of that portion commanded by me, to protect the property of the citizens, whose territory was invaded without regard to their sentiments, whether Union or secession." This mindset of now total conquest would lead him and guide him when he became the general of the Union Army. And as Grant pursued Lee in the North, he turned to his trusted friend, General William Tecumseh Sherman, to carry out this total war in the South. And that he would do. William Tecumseh Sherman is believed to have said, that war is hell. And in fact, he would bring hell, brimstone and fire and all, to the South in carrying out this total war that had been envisioned by Ulysses S. Grant. The story here begins on September 2 of 1864, when Union General William Tecumseh Sherman defeated the Confederacy in Atlanta. Now, instead of pursuing the retreating Confederate Army into Tennessee, William Tecumseh Sherman decided to continue his drive further south to completely decimate the land. As he wrote during this time, quote, "We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war." Along with the more than 60,000 soldiers at his disposal, Sherman burned Atlanta to the ground and destroyed its railroads before embarking on a 300-mile march to the sea in November of 1864. Again, total war, destroying people's homes, towns' businesses, the roads, the railroads, basically ensuring that every semblance of normalcy is brought to destruction during this time. Well, by February of 1865, Sherman reached South Carolina, the state that first seceded from the Union, where he ravaged the countryside and went on to its capital, Columbia, where Sherman and his men wanted to punish the first state to secede by burning the business district, the churches, and wealthy residences. An Ohio sergeant who was under Sherman's command wrote in his diary during this time that he told his men to, quote, "Every house, barn, fence, and cotton gin gets an application of the torch. That prospect is revolting, but war is an uncivil game and can't be civilized." So here we see that idea again. I cannot overstate it enough. Total war, total destruction. There are no innocents in this war. The South was a hostile nation and a hostile people, and they had to be destroyed completely, and their morale decimated. Well, eventually, a very symbolic event took place here off the coast of South Carolina at Fort Sumter. On April 14th, Major Robert Anderson, who we talked about earlier in this lecture, raised the American flag once again over Fort Sumter, symbolizing a victory as the final march to victory of the total war. It will occur quickly here in 1865. What I want to do now is move our lens, if you will, further north, because by doing so we will see that General Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, did not have enough troops to deal with both Grant in the north and Sherman in the south. To make matters worse, Grant and Lee traded blows in an extended battle of trench warfare around Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg, Virginia was a major railroad hub and Confederate supply route, so this was a big deal for the Confederates to make sure that they held it and maintained it. Now this battle of trench warfare back and forth, lasted all the way from June 1864 to March of 1865. The following month, in April of 1865, after General Grant secured Petersburg, Virginia, he would also take Richmond, Virginia, which was the Confederacy's capital. And what we are eventually going to see is, though Lee would very briefly escape, Grant prevented Lee from moving beyond North Carolina and eventually forced the Confederates to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th, thus ending this long, drawn-out, deadly war. Now, speaking of death, because it seemed like in Civil War here, death was everywhere. And I want to show you how much this was the case. So the Mexican-American War, if you remember when we talked about that conflict, the Mexican-American War resulted in 13,000 American deaths. And of those 13,000, as we talked about earlier, only 2,000 actually occurred on the battlefield. The rest were due to disease. So let's talk about how that compares to the Civil War. A much longer battle, obviously, but nonetheless, it's a good comparison point. For over 100 years, it has been accepted that just under 620,000 men died in the Civil War, 360,000 from the North and 258,000 from the South. In 2012, however, one historian argued convincingly that the number of deaths was actually closer to 750,000. Now, think about this for a second. The total population in 1860 was about 31 million people. So, based on these percentages, 750,000 out of 31 million, a similar war today would cause about 7.5 million deaths, because obviously the population is bigger. So what we are seeing is essentially 7.5 million people perishing. Obviously it's not that many, 750,000, but that large of a percentage of the population dying because of this war. And of course the fighting style played a role in this. Basically you have the march forward and they're shooting right in front of each other. But nonetheless, even a Union surgeon who's seen blood day in and day out spoke of his experiences after Antietam, and here's what he wrote. The dead were almost totally unburied and stretched along in one straight line ready for interment. At least 1,000 blackened, bloated corpses with blood and gas protruding from every orifice and maggots holding high carnival over their heads. This is what war was. And of course, as the war was prolonged and it continued on and it became more total, if you will, it became even more deadly. But this was the cost to preserve the Union and ultimately to end slavery. And what we will see in the next lecture is this transformation within Lincoln himself, as he goes from someone who is mainly opposed to the expansion and extension of slavery in new territory to a man that will actually call for the end of slavery. That is a topic that we'll pick up in the next lecture.